Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Emily Hyssong. I'm the embedded CAP social worker in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. We're going to talk about pandemic anxiety management, which I think, gosh, in some ways we'll talk more about anxiety management in general. And as we're in this current state, I think it's important to bring in kind of all of the different ways that it's impacting us. And I think we're just going to kind of gloss over some aspects of it. We're not going to be able to get to everything, but I'd love for this to be as helpful as it possibly can for you all too. So please unmute yourselves if you have a question and just try to jump in. I can't see everyone's faces while I'm screen sharing. So again, kind of hang with me. So if you want to share something, if you have a question, let's make this interactive and more of a dialogue and not just me talking at you. If we want to kind of to make this more personal, I'd love for you all to think just for a second, kind of checking in with yourselves. What are some things that are kind of in your bucket right now that are causing you particularly more anxiety or stress, kind of what you're sitting with? So just doing that, maybe 30-second check in with yourself. Okay, so again, I think just starting from a framework of normalization to start, I think it's really important to expect that we're going to have different levels of anxiety, given the fact that this is a pandemic, and the fact that we've been at it for a year, living through this. It's not that it necessarily just kind of goes away or gets easier to navigate through all of these different pieces of it. So working from home is one layer. I think for a lot of us, not being able to perform in person, I'm sure for all of you, is another piece that's hitting. But again, kind of all of these different layers collaborating to make it heavier at different times for all of us. One of the expressions that I came across in starting to look at this presentation was just this idea that because it's a pandemic, that we're almost thinking about when we're telling ourselves not to be anxious because of it. It's like telling water not to be wet. And that resonated with me, that this in and of itself is anxiety inducing and provoking. And I think the kinder we can be to ourselves during that, the better we're going to be able to tolerate it. So it's not a question of, can I be anxiety free? Because that might not be the goal, but really, how can I best manage the anxiety that does show up? And so we'll talk today kind of around that as that mindset of not how do I just make it go away or make it better? Because in some ways I wish I could have that magic wand for all of you. And we know that that's not all that kind of realistic. So how do we manage the anxiety that does come up? How do we start from that place of normalization, that it makes sense that we're feeling different types of anxiety and stress during this? And how do I be self-compassionate about that? I like to start my presentations now with some stretching. So if we all just want to maybe join in, I'm going to stand for a second, just kind of rolling our shoulders, our necks, noticing where we need to stretch based on the fact that we're probably sitting and staring at screens a lot more. So I like starting this discussion too with a broader understanding around what is mental health. So it's our social, emotional, and psychological well-being. How we think, feel, and act, and how that's impacted. But it's also how do we handle stress and relate to others, make choices. So it's a lot of the times the lens that we're seeing the world through, or a framework that we're seeing the world through. And I think it's important to kind of recognize this is not an all or nothing concept. It's not either that I have good mental health or I don't, but really that this is on a continuum, that our mental health can kind of slide up or slide down. It's not a fixed condition, and that we can keep working on it. We can take charge of it when we notice that we're at a point on that continuum where we don't think is sustainable or helpful or healthy. Um, we look at what impacts or what affects mental health. Um, there's a lot of different variables. So when we're talking about kind of pandemic anxiety, we're looking a lot at what are those external variables. And again, I think that with this year, year and a half, there have been so many pieces that are maybe COVID specific and COVID related of the different stay-at-home orders, the health concerns that we might be experiencing or experiencing for those that we care about that are close to us. And so all of that kind of environment is something that is impacting our mental health, something that we're probably carrying. And then along that same vein, there's the other cultural, social, political factors that are happening. In our world, in our country, it's been a really difficult year for a lot of us. And recognizing too that I'm a white individual and that the way that some of these events have impacted me is really different than my BIPOC colleagues, friends, clients. So again, I think just making space and thinking about that together of how these external variables impact my mental health, how they impact yours, and really taking that into consideration. Other kind of internal variables impact our mental health too. So our kind of biology and psychology, our brain structures, maybe family history, our temperament or personality. So I'm wondering with kind of good mental health, how many of you have thought about maybe some of the things at the bottom, so that like good mental health is feeling happy 100% of the time, or like living a life without problems, or being perfect. At least for me, I think those are narratives that I hear a lot around, if only, one of these things could be true, or maybe it's a slightly different narrative for you that you're holding around that should or supposed to. So I think, recognizing that good mental health, a lot of times what we're thinking about from like a psychological lens or level is not necessarily the absence of difficulty, but it's the ability to navigate through that. It's thinking about kind of that resiliency piece, being able to recognize how is my body impacted by my stress, how is that connection, and how is my physical health and my mental health kind of improving or being impacted by each other. So actively coping and taking care of ourselves is a muscle. I think it's a hygiene, and it's really different based on different stressors. So, again, the current stressors around all of these different pieces of pandemic life in 2021, I think they impact our mental health more than previous years. And again, I think that the layering impact of that can also, so the way that we've been coping, say the way that we were coping in 2019 might be really different than the way that we needed to cope last year or this year. I like kind of pointing out this idea too, that an early intervention can often prevent a crisis. So if we're trying to promote a culture of kind of a proactive intervention, that can be really helpful. So we're not necessarily doing reactive work, but we're looking at proactive. So before I get to that tipping point, what do I need? I think that checking in with ourselves can be so vital. But if we're not super in tune with that, or we're not kind of confident in our skill set and being able to check in with ourselves yet, that's okay. I think that's something that can be learned and taught. And that might be a great way to start a conversation with a therapist of, if I'm noticing that I'm at that tipping point or I'm in crisis a lot, how do I start to be a little bit more discerning of what contributes for me getting there? So as a kind of tease in or a lead into coping. So I think self-care and coping allows us to, again, have that hygiene aspect of it, to take care of ourselves more regularly, that help us to kind of allow the tipping over to happen less frequently. So I like to use that like measure and cup analogy that maybe some of you have heard, but this idea that our stress is Our emotional stress is kind of filling up cups. And we all are functioning at a different level with that fullness every day. So the pandemic, kind of different ways that it's hitting, might be filling up your cups with some of those really big pieces. It might be some of the Asian hate crimes that were just happening in the country, and seeing about how that's been sitting for you. It might be that you have maybe a family member or somebody that's really struggling financially. Maybe it's you. Again, some of those elements that are in those cups sometimes are not in our control. And it might kind of add or accumulate to be in a way that we're feeling just really overwhelmed by the day-to-day. And so again, kind of starting first and foremost with a place of like normalization, that it makes sense that there are certain things that would fill up our cups all the way and feel really overwhelming. And there are other kind of pieces that we're putting in our cups as being students, as being just humans that need to function, that also add stressors. So the idea of this measuring cup is to, one, kind of have a visualization of it, to check in of where am I in that fullness? What are the elements that are in my cup right now? And if I'm at a brimming point or overflowing, that might be what we would think of as crisis. If I'm at that kind of unsustainable level of too much, okay, that's really good data. Let's take that in. And let's start to think about what are some ways that I can kind of consistently drain that cup, or take some small things out, or be really mindful of anything else that I'm bringing back in. Because again, we know that there are pieces in that cup that are outside of our control. If we had that magic wand, we could change some things. But because we don't, how do we keep being really kind of cognizant of what's allowed to fill up my emotional cup day to day? So again, if we look back at this slide, thinking about self-care and coping as, I think, really essential, and being able to kind of drain some of that stress in that cup more regularly. So I think our physical health can be that foundational piece. So our exercise, our sleep, our diet. If we're not eating or sleeping, we're not going to be able to use like our frontal lobe, our kind of executive planner effectively. So we still might be able to do a lot. We can push ourselves pretty far, but we're going to be much more kind of volatile, and we're going to handle that stress a lot kind of less effectively. So I think for a lot of us as students, we get that feedback that sleep is not necessary, or let's kind of put it to the back burner. And I'll be maybe one kind of solo voice in saying that I think sleep is really essential. Eating is really essential in just, again, creating that stability for ourselves to take on the heavier, the higher level kind of cognitive load that we are. We'll get more into the other kind of pieces of taking care of ourselves, but social support. So thinking about how are we engaging in that now? I know that feels really different for most of us. I think practicing self-compassion is something I'll keep talking about kind of throughout, but how are we being kinder to ourselves about the things that are hard, about the things that are taking up more space for us? Sometimes it is just taking a timeout or unplug. And maybe it's processing our experiences. So maybe it's thinking about, again, kind of what are those stressors in your cup, and finding people that have shared experiences right now. If it's kind of different stressors based on identity, maybe it's finding people that share that identity right now with you to have a little bit more that sense of community, or kind of less alienation or isolation with it. I think that, again, the idea of community building and support now looks so different, and is not any less important or essential for our well-being. Another kind of big bullet is checking in with our cognitive styles. So what are our thinking patterns? And noticing, when am I thinking in a way that is helpful or constructive for me? And when is that thinking pattern really getting in the way? Maybe it's more thematic of maybe even catastrophizing. So that's one that, gosh, I think is so much easier to do these days, because we, in some ways, have gotten a lot of kind of positive feedback for that catastrophe. Whereas before we would say, nope, that's really catastrophizing. We don't need to think about that thought. And, again, kind of discerning what those thoughts are. Are they helpful? It's harder sometimes when we're living in kind of, again, just a different world right now. So if we had that kind of foundation around mental health, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about anxiety. So just to give a little bit more clarity or language around what anxiety is specifically. So just to start, it's an emotion. So we all experience anxiety. I think that a lot of times anxiety is something that we think of as a bad thing. And I'll talk a little bit today about how it can be helpful. Anxiety is a feeling of apprehension or worry. And it's this anticipation that a potential threat may or may not happen. And it's usually in the future. So a lot of what anxiety is this what if, this what's going to happen. So a lot of times when we're talking about anxiety, we're thinking about the future, the what if, the what's going to happen. And why that is so helpful is because it makes us good planners. It probably keeps us pretty conscientious. It helps us to stay on top of things. I like thinking about that scanning the horizon as part of anxiety. We're looking for what could the threat be, and then our body and our brains are trying to react to that. So it's adaptive. Anxiety is something that is built into our system to keep us safe. And we want to really be thoughtful around sometimes the way that loop or that feedback loop is working is no longer all that helpful. It's no longer accurate that it is a threat or that it's something that we need to kind of engage with or fix or solve. But it's looking at kind of, again, normalizing it, that it makes sense that I would feel apprehension or fear about this kind of perceived or real threat. And the management of that, or the way that I can sit with that, is going to be maybe more effective if I can shift it, or if I can say, oh, no, this is actually not a current threat that I need to deal with. I think it's important too that sometimes our source of anxiety isn't always known or recognized. And I think during this time, this might be more common because we're all sitting with more chronic anxiety and stress. So if we're noticing that just that heightened level of kind of fullness in our cup, or maybe tension, it's real. And I think just, again, stating that and owning that our anxiety is higher now. I think just as a country, as a world, and that we don't always have a help. It's because of this one thing. And it might be because there's a lot of it, right? So it's just, oh, okay, there's maybe 20 different things right now in my stress cup that are taking up room, that are causing just that felt experience of tension. And it could be something that is really different kind of day to day, or based on, again, what else am I able to do in terms of that coping? So comparing, contrasting kind of normal anxiety versus clinical, again, I think anxiety is an essential part of being human. It's an emotion that, again, is very protective and helpful for us in staying alive and safe. And we sometimes are noticing when there's too much of it, or it's functioning in an unhelpful way, that it's starting to interact with my ability to really achieve the goals that I need to or want to. We look at impairment in a clinical lens for diagnostic ability. So like how and where is it impairing you? Is it stopping you from accomplishing the goals that you have? Is it preventing you from engaging in relationships? Is it kind of getting in the way of your performance or professional hopes or goals? So again, kind of taking that with a grain of salt, that I'm not talking about anxiety today just to pathologize it or just to name kind of where is it the most extreme, but noticing for yourselves kind of where we're all falling on that continuum of when is my anxiety maybe functioning in a way that kind of makes sense or is manageable, and when is it really kind of coming out as a flavor that feels like it's causing more impairment than it should. And as a clinician, I think you all know yourselves best. And even in my field, we do diagnose often. And I think it's really important, that idea that you do know yourselves best. So you are able to say, this is higher for me than I think it should be. And that's, I think, what the kind of more important piece of discerning that is. Is it a clinical level of anxiety or not? And again, that might be something to think about more, or start a conversation with me or a therapist about, if that's something you're questioning. Just to put up some symptoms of anxiety so we can get a little bit more clarity around what does it look like? What are we talking about? So excessive worry, difficulty controlling that worry. So it's not saying that any worry is necessarily anxiety, but it's that felt sense of that apprehension, that overwhelming worry, or that inability to kind of disengage from those worry thoughts. A lot of times we might notice it being something that disturbs our sleep. So having those worry thoughts at night, or early in the morning, maybe when we're trying to go back to sleep. And as a result, we might actually be easily fatigued because we're constantly doing a lot more mental work, maybe than a peer, and being impacted in that way. Kind of while we're trying to sleep, we might not be getting as many hours as we should. I think irritability is one that comes up a lot in a missed symptom. So I think it's important to notice that sometimes the way that we're experiencing, even depression has irritability as a symptom, but sometimes the way that we're experiencing stress is that we come kind of into spaces being more charged, more irritable, kind of quicker with our fuse. And I think that's an important piece to recognize, that can be a symptom of anxiety or depression. It's not necessarily just saying that we, are irritable people, or that we're grouchy, but really, okay, we're holding too much. There's something that isn't working well with our balance of this. Again, kind of with worry or having excess of worry thoughts, it messes with our concentration because our brain is trying to do a lot more of this checking, this scanning, this attention to this threat that may or may not be useful for us to engage with right now. And lastly, muscle tension. So kind of, I've been doing this with my shoulders, but kind of how we're holding our bodies is sometimes an interesting tell around how are we feeling. And I'll notice that in certain days, oh, okay, I need to put my shoulders down, because the way that sometimes I carry stress is by doing that. So again, kind of noticing for ourselves, where are we holding our own anxiety or tension? And comparing and contrasting. So we've been talking about both stress and anxiety, and they're not the same. But they do reinforce and perpetuate each other. And kind of why this is important, the idea of being chronically stressed can set us up for developing anxiety or depression. Quick summary slide of kind of that magic wand piece. We won't be able to fix this all with a slide, but I think, again, it's important to look at how are we managing it. That our management needs to shift based on the amount of stress or anxiety that we're holding, and the causes of it. So the way that our fullness is based on, again, what are those kind of bigger items in that cup? We might need different coping strategies to help tolerate or manage that. So now I want to jump into a bit more of kind of what are some of these options about management broken down and ways that we're going to impact that. One of the ways that we might want to think about items that are in our control, one of them might be this idea of unplugging. So the way that we're expected to show up now in virtual work is to be very present and to have less distinction between kind of home life and work life, on and off. And as students, I'm sure you're experiencing that more, even in that you don't have a lot of times typical kind of work hours. So the work hours for a student is kind of whenever you can fit it in. So when do you have breaks from even your computers, your screens, might be a really important way to kind of pull back or notice for yourself what's the impact that I'm having. One of the really kind of persistent themes in all of this is the impact that media has on us, and that the intake of media can really be detrimental to our well-being sometimes. So especially if we're reading maybe the same headlines over and over again that feel really, really awful, just kind of what that does to us. So is it useful for us to continue to engage in maybe re-experiencing that emotional reaction if we've already kind of taken in that data? So again, something to keep thinking about for ourselves of what that personal impact is of where we might want to unplug or need to. I was jumping ahead just a little bit. Again, this idea of how coverage is impacting us on given topics. I think we all probably are trying to be informed what's happening in our world, and probably more so given a lot of the current events. But really, again, noticing what's the impact that it's having on me today, and on me based on my identities. So if there's things that are more triggering for you, or you're feeling fuller or more impacted, let's be really thoughtful or careful about, again, is this something that I've already seen, I've already kind of informed myself on, I've already been exposed to, or is this something that I need to do that? Does it feel helpful for me to learn more about this at this time? I think, again, kind of checking in with yourself and doing what feels best is a really simple task to say and a really difficult thing to do. But noticing, is it the way that I'm, checking my email? Is it that constant feeling of being on or available that is adding to my stress and my stress cup, maybe again in that optional way, whereas a lot of these other pieces of stressors are not optional. So just some concrete ideas or tips. Maybe it's putting your phone on do not disturb during certain periods of the day. Maybe it's when you're practicing. Maybe it's when you're sleeping. Setting time limits for yourself for watching, reading, listening to media. And maybe it's thinking about turning news alerts off if you have those on, given, again, kind of certain times, or if there are certain things going on that feel like you're just getting kind of bombarded with things that feel emotionally heavy for you at this time. So thinking about time management in this piece. So I know this is a little bit of a right turn, but in some ways I think it really applies to our anxiety, given that we're asked to be doing a lot of different things in a different way. So the way that we stay motivated or engaged might have already needed to get like a refresh. And it might be something that we're still kind of, I used the word clunky before, kind of navigating through that. There's a lot that feels different. So again, just this first bullet point of creating a routine can help us cope with uncertainty. And again, naming that this is a time where we have had more uncertainty than other times. I think that there's so much in kind of anxiety in general that is about the unknown. And if we think about, again, the definition of anxiety is this fear of the what if or the future, and oftentimes the unknown. And if 2020 taught us anything, it's that we're bad at predicting the future. We are generally really bad, but we think we're good at it. We think we can predict the future, which is why our anxiety voice often will try to kind of engage us in that of, what can happen? How do we do this? Kind of problem solving or planning. So again, I think kind of owning that and naming that our anxiety voice or our brain is trying to be helpful, but bringing it back to what could be concrete. So looking at our motivation and our time management might be one of the ways that we do that. So we're anchoring ourselves into what is in my control, because I know I can't control or predict the future. What are the things that I can take care of in this moment? Again, I think this might be things that you've already been able to accomplish, given that we've been in this for a while, but if not, these are bullet points that give some ideas around setting structure and listening to yourself around what's useful there. So yeah, I don't know if you all have seen these before, but I like the idea of having SMART goals so that we can feel, again, like we're in some kind of control over what we're taking on, that our goals need to be specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and timely. And again, as performers or musicians, sometimes goals can get a little bit more kind of intangible or less concrete, and bringing it back into what can I kind of make more specific about it? What can I make realistic, or check that through a realistic lens? And what's my time limit for trying to accomplish this? I talked about this before. I'll just reiterate. Sleep is really essential for our foundation. So just some tips to think about sleeping a little bit better if that's something that you're struggling with. I think I'll just highlight the jotting down racing thoughts. So a lot of times I'm talking with students around, again, the cognitive pieces getting in the way of sleep. So I'm trying to think a lot, I'm trying to plan a lot, I'm trying to kind of problem solve through these worries, and that's impacting my sleep. Starting with that place, that makes a lot of sense. When we're finally able to kind of slow down for the day, it makes sense that that part of our brain turns on. And I will always kind of advocate that we should be doing that elsewhere, not in bed or right before bed. So if that's something that you're noticing, okay, every time I lay down to go to sleep, I start worrying or I start planning. Okay, let's make a little bit of a separation between bed and that. So if you can do that, even 30 minutes before you go to bed, maybe you get to have what we call like worry time. We make this time limited, that it's okay to have time where we worry. It makes sense that our brains want to, but we want to put some kind of parameters around that, that it needs to be time limited, and that it can't be the thing that we're doing whilst trying to fall asleep, because of course our brains are going to be activated by that. They're engaging thoughts, and then we're going to kind of activate our bodies and then stay awake. Just another example of how these times are different. So I think boundaries are always something interesting to talk about as being a person and interacting with people in the world. They're challenging, and during pandemic world life, they're different. So how are we noting our boundaries, what we feel comfortable with, and expressing those to others? So it might be boundaries around masks. It might be boundaries around vaccines. Maybe with roommates or housemates. But how are we communicating our needs to others? It's a challenge. So boundaries in general are just rules or guidelines that create to show others how to treat us. So they're relationships that work best when we're clear. When we're clear about our expectations of others, then other people can engage in a way that feels okay for us. I think it's really important to keep working on boundary setting if that's something that you're struggling with. It's something I'd love to talk more about. I think they're hard, and they're very helpful. And we want to really be thoughtful around kind of where are we struggling with them? Is it a person-specific struggle, or is it I'm struggling to set boundaries everywhere? We want to think about too that boundaries can be different kind of depending on what relationship, what context, but all relationships have boundaries. We all need boundaries in every relationship that we're in. We just want to be thoughtful about kind of the flexibility there. So is it a fence with a gate? Is it a fence that is made out of stone? Is it a cedar fence? Kind of where do we need to have those boundaries, and why are we having them? What's the intentionality behind them? Loneliness, again, is a topic that comes up, I think, a lot more now, and is a pretty common experience, I think, just as a human, and during pandemic time, where we are different in the way that we're able to connect with others. So I like this idea that loneliness is contagious. So we want to think about exercising our social muscle. And again, the way that we're engaging with others now, it might be different, but it still is important. So I like the idea that we don't necessarily have the ability to get maybe the same types of emotional or connective fills that we used to. So we're maybe not, going to meet a group of friends and giving hugs. But could we think about doing smaller ways that we can connect or fill that emotional that void? So it might be reaching out and asking somebody a question instead of avoiding a conversation. When the pandemic just first started, I remember walking around a park and noticing that people weren't making eye contact. And I remember thinking that, like, wow, okay, people are afraid right now. We're not connecting even with eyes when we know that it's not something that we can like catch through looking at someone. But so again, kind of checking ourselves with where we're at and what feels helpful, that we can make eye contact with a stranger. We can smile if we don't have a mask on. We can smile with a mask on. Again, we can say hello, and noticing like, what does it feel like to have small social engagements during a day versus having none? Because again, I would argue that fills our kind of emotional void, even if it's 2% or 5%. That's more full than zero. And if we're waiting for the time where we can hug people again, oh, that would be nice. And it might be a little bit too long for us to feel well during this wait period. So checking in with ourselves of what do we need, and where are we able to get some of those smaller fills? Can we go for a walk and again say hi to somebody that we don't know from a distance? Can we engage in a Zoom call or a gathering that feels okay for us? If we're working with others, checking in around again, like how to check in with each other. That just because we're wearing masks doesn't mean we can't connect or care. So this is a concept around our stressors that we're experiencing, really leading to us feeling kind of flooded. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and we feel a lot of impact when we have collective too much stress. So this concept is a cortisol-soaked brain, that really we're just dealing with that idea that there's too much of the same like chemical around. So what we've been talking about as a whole is the kind of the filtering of our cup, or kind of poking holes in that intensity, giving ourselves a break. So again, you all know yourselves best of what's useful, what's helpful for you. These are just some extra ideas that you might add or get reminded of that were useful for you that maybe you're not prioritizing. Just a few more, wanting to really be thoughtful around our words too. And I think some of these strategies are kind of trial and error. So if we are noticing getting really caught in our narrative around stress or emotionality, I like that idea of doing those different things. Oh, and I had a note here too. So just thinking this idea of engaging in new and unfamiliar tasks to keep our brain occupied, right? So keeping our brain away from those worry thoughts or distraction, and learning kind of activates that the hippocampus. So our increasing the volume of our brain actually. Oh, that's interesting. I forgot about that. So yeah, so again, like using those different kind of pieces. So the hippocampus is kind of storing new memories and making new memories. And so we're again allowing our brain just to kind of take on a different challenge or a different task, instead of regurgitating or reiterating the same. I think these are again really big bullets, but really important things to keep thinking about or marinating on. So a lot of times we're talking about our words having so much impact. So shifting the way that we're talking to ourselves is self-compassion, a kind of mindset. So if we're telling ourselves that we want to do something, how that feels so different than telling myself I should do it. Replacing but with and. So again, instead of having that black or white or that all or nothing, can I have something that's more in the middle? I like the idea of establishing a relationship with our emotions, checking in with our feelings throughout the day. So noticing where am I in that intensity in that cup, maybe multiple times per day. It might be right after I feel really overwhelmed by something, or I notice, oh, my shoulders are up. Okay, what's going on with that? What just happened that led me to feel that flooding or just that tipping over? We didn't talk about mindfulness today, but mindfulness, again, I think allows us to be more in this moment, in the present. And we talked in the beginning that anxiety is often about the future. So what am I going to be doing? What's going to happen? All of those what ifs and all of those next steps. So that blinder that we're putting up with mindfulness is allowing for a break. Being just here and just now allows us to focus on the task at hand or the moment here, and not about those futuristic thoughts. And then really lastly, so just knowing kind of when is it too much? So when is what I've been doing on my own to cope not really working? I think it's okay to recognize that we've hit our limit, or maybe we can no longer remind ourselves of the helpful things that we used to do, and reaching out for help. So that might be for me, for talking with a friend, or it might be thinking about finding a therapist more long term. So we'll talk about kind of options there. On this slide, there are both our CAPS website and Psychology Today. Just a little bit more about CAPS, since that's where I'm from. CAPS is short-term or brief treatment, and during remote work, so we are seeing students virtually, and that'll continue for a little while. If you want or need somebody to talk to, I always think that CAPS is a great place to start. We are always thinking about what we call a case management. So if we're the best place for you, great. And if we're not, we're also, part of our job is having that conversation with you. So if you're looking for something longer term, or you are, sadly, we can't see students ongoing right now if you're out of state. So if that's your situation, I'm also happy to work with students around getting you connected to somebody more local. So I had Psychology Today up on this slide. That's a great place to start. And sometimes where I'll refer students, just generally you can sort by insurance and specialization, that kind of thing. And then CAPS just in general, this is my email address, so EMHYSS. If you want to continue talking with me about stuff from today, or set up an appointment, or ask questions about how to, email is the best way to get a hold of me, so feel free. And then CAPS in general, our website's here, and we can do online scheduling now. So if you would like to meet with me or someone that I work with, feel free to check us out. I've got a whole lot of colleagues, so if I'm not your kind of cup of tea, or if I have an identity that doesn't align with what you're hoping to work on, I have got a lot of diverse coworkers that might be. So feel free to check us out and see kind of who might match a little bit better if it's not me. Another thing I'll say really quick is that on the back of your M-Card, students, we do have our CAPS line, and that functions as a crisis line after hours when we're closed. So if you're not sure who to talk to, or need somebody to talk to after CAPS is closed, you can always call and be connected with somebody there. And two last things I'll say, we do now have options for an interactive module online, so it's called Silver Cloud. It's CBT oriented, so looking more at our kind of thoughts, our behaviors, and emotions, and that interaction. But it's self-guided, so if kind of worksheets or clicking through visuals is helpful for your learning style, I think that's a great place to get a little bit more reinforcement on some of those too. And then our Stress Busters app provides some guided meditations and breathing exercises, and both of those are free, so feel free to check those out if you'd like to. And we've got a few minutes if anyone has questions or wants to think about anything together. I'm happy to.